duties, so they cannot present this in person. Opposition to war has a long history in Australia, although it's always been expressed by minority groups. These commenced with a few courageous individuals who opposed Australia's involvement in the South African War and earlier campaigns, and swelled to the thousands who took to the streets in the Vietnam moratorium marches of 1970 and 71. I define a conscientious objector as someone who has a philosophical and or ethical objection to undergoing military training and service, usually based on an abhorrence of killing one's fellow human being. While some objectors felt able to perform non-combatant duties such as clerical, kitchen work, stores, medical and other duties that didn't involve carrying arms and going into battle, others believed that to perform non-combatant duties was as immoral as to be a combatant, but all of these roles assisted in the war effort. Opposition to conscription for military training began in the first decade of the 20th century when the 1909 Defence Act was amended to legalise the enforcement of domestic law and order and to incorporate a scheme of compulsory military training for 14 to 18-year-old boys. The scheme began in 1911. The only provision for conscientious objection to this was to offer men with religious scruples the option of non-combatant service. It took 2 years to put into effect and began in 1911. Some of Australia's first objectors to military service, therefore, were teenage boys and their parents. There were harsh punishments for evasion, fines ranging from £5 to £100 or imprisonment. There was no provision for objectors or exemptions except on the grounds that I've put on the slide, these being medical unfitness, school teachers at naval or military institutions, theological students, members of the permanent naval and military forces, non-Europeans for combatant roles only, criminals or persons of unsound mind. However, some boys and young men avoided penalty and drills simply by living too far from a drill hall to be able to attend. Opponents of the scheme included those listed on this slide, the 4 Labor senators Ray, Gardner, Reddy and Long, who went against their own party to oppose the legislation, union activists such as Harry Holland, his son was conscripted, and he was the author of a pamphlet entitled The Crime of Conscription, and also the Quaker John Hills, who wrote a quite substantial booklet titled Child Conscription, Our Country's Shame. The Quakers established the Australian Freedom League to fight for the repeal of the legislation. By June 1915, after the scheme had been in operation about 3 years, some 28,000 boys had been prosecuted. Many were boys who could not attend training because of work commitments rather than because they had a strong ethical objection to military training and service, but a small minority was prepared to and did endure prison sentences, including solitary confinement and military barracks, rather than undergo the training. One particularly obnoxious aspect of the compulsory training scheme was that boys who, for whatever reason, failed the drill or prosecuted appeared in a public court, usually without any legal defence, and gained a criminal record. In the busiest cities, 25 cases could be heard in an hour. At Fremantle, 140 cases were heard in one day, 188 in one day at the Sydney Water Police Court. One of the scheme's opponents, Reverend Leighton Richards, wrote, "Australia is making rebels in scores and hundreds." Many, of course, did do their drills, they knuckled down, and when it was expected of them, they served overseas, and they died in their thousands. Some were so bruised by the system, including the penalties of solitary confinement on bread and water, that they disappeared for the duration of the war, working somewhere in the outback rather than giving their lives for their country. Despite the fact that, unlike the Allied governments in Britain, Canada and New Zealand, the Australian government did not impose conscription for overseas military service in World War I, there were still conscientious objectors. Call-up for the compulsory training schemes continued and prosecutions were carried out against those who failed to enlist. On the 29th of September 1916, a month before the first conscription referendum, the Governor-General issued a proclamation calling upon all single and childless males of 21 to 35 years to attend for enlistment in the armed forces. John Curtin was among those arrested for failing to enlist. Curtin was convicted and served 3.5 days in prison before being released after his friends lobbied the Minister for Defence, Senator Pearce. In the final year of the war, 1918, peace activists set a strong wave of public opinion to seek a negotiated peace. A mass rally in Brisbane in February 1918 combined speakers from the Quakers, militant Labourites and feminist activists such as Vida Goldstein. So-called loyalists claimed that the foul weed of disloyalty flourished most luxuriantly in Queensland. The pacifists were branded as members of the industrial workers of the world. Nevertheless, events on the Western Front indicated that the pacifists had a point. Whether it would have been possible to negotiate a peace in early 1918 is a matter for conjecture, but so many lives would have been saved if it had been. When World War II began, Prime Minister Robert Menzies immediately reintroduced the compulsory military training scheme, which had been allowed to lapse in 1929. All males aged 18 to 60 years became liable to serve in the citizen forces for the duration of the war. The only form of exemption allowed was for the performance of non-combatant duties. A conscientious objector was defined as, quote, one who, on religious grounds, thinks it is wrong to kill or resist by force. Immediately, the pacifist groups and individuals began campaigning for amendments to the Defence Act to protect objectors. In Britain, there was provision for both civilian work as an alternative to military service, which was known as conditional registration, and unconditional registration, that is total exemption. The Australian government did not legislate conditional registration until July 1941, and then only by overriding the fierce opposition of some of its own members. In August 1941, the words, "I will resist His Majesty's enmity," which many objectors had refused to utter, were removed from the oath or affirmation required of non-combatants. The government hoped that this would end prosecutions for refusing to take the oath. In October 1942, the federal government began conscripting men for civilian work, introducing a compulsory call-up for the Manpower Commission. In 1943, women workers were also conscripted. Many objectors who refused to perform non-combatant duties also refused to enlist in the Civil Construction Corps, whose tasks included building military airstrips or to perform other work for military purposes. How many objectors were there? According to figures released after the war by the Department of the Army, 2,791 men claimed exemption from compulsory service on the grounds of conscientious belief between 1939 and 1945. These figures may be correct as at the end of 1943, but they cannot refer to the whole of the war. This is because the pacifist newspaper The Peacemaker published almost identical figures as these at the end of December, 31st of December 1943. Three other factors point to the likelihood of the Army's figures relating only to the 1939 to 43 period rather than the whole war. Firstly, in June 1943, the lifting of the ban on Jehovah's Witnesses resulted in many applications being processed in the latter years of the war, 1944-45. In July 1944, Jehovah's Witnesses were recognised as ministers of religion and therefore a lot more were eligible for exemption and applied for exemption. Thirdly, when objectors were granted the right of appeal in June 1943, they became eligible to apply for exemption from combatant and non-combatant service, and that precipitated a lot more applications in 1943-44. And another point that one might add to those three, many Christadelphians didn't apply for exemption at all as part of their belief. So it's possible that Australian conscientious objectors to military service in World War II numbered at least 5,000, possibly more. While this is a tiny number compared with the 993,000 men and women who served in the armed forces during the war, it's nevertheless a significant group. It was, after all, very difficult being a conchi, as they were called. Contrary to widely held opinion, objectors were motivated by cowardice, as shown in the illustration, and self-interest. It took considerable courage and maturity to make such a stand. Who were the objectors? When I began researching my book Peacemongers, I decided to try and identify as many individual objectors as possible. The results of my research were two samples. 90 objectors served one or more terms of imprisonment, ranging from 7 days to 6 months, in either a civil or a military prison or a detention centre, and 410 people expressed a conscientious objection to military service, but did not, as far as I can ascertain, serve a prison sentence. Of this latter group, a few were exempt from call-up on the grounds of age, profession and possibly gender, although women, even married women with children, were expected to register for manpower, and the sample contains 7 women who were imprisoned for a short period of time. The sample of those eligible for call-up, prisoners and non-prisoners, therefore totals 500 people. Well, objectors could be male or female of any age from 18 upwards, and they came from a wide diversity of backgrounds, workplaces and educational levels. However, my sample indicated that World War II conscientious objectors were most likely to be under 35 years of age, male, members of the Jehovah's Witnesses, who were 24%, or Christadelphians, 29% of my sample, tradesmen, farmers or ministers of religion, rather than professionals or business people. Resident in New South Wales, 40% of prisoners and 23% of non-prisoners, or Victoria, 27% and 32% respectively. Resident in non-metropolitan areas, at least 34% of the prisoners were from outside the city. Because of the narrowness of the definition of objector, it was very hard for an agnostic or an atheist to prove that he was a genuine objector. 68% of prisoners, 63% of non-prisoners stated they had a religious objection to taking military service. A few admitted to being non-religious. One man claimed his inspiration from Mahatma Gandhi. Others merely expressed a conscientious objection or objected on the grounds of the infringement of civil liberties. Support groups offered legal advice and other practical assistance to objectors, and I've put some of the steps that were given on this slide. How effective were these groups? There was some correlation between membership of a supporting pacifist or religious group and non-imprisonment in Victoria. For example, only 3% of prisoners belonged to the Victorian Objectors group, while 9% of non-prisoners were members. But in New South Wales, 13% of prisoners were members of the Sydney CO's group. Sydney magistrates seem to have judged particularly harshly. The New South Wales Objectors Central Committee stated in September 1944 that 68% of appeals heard in that state since the commencement of the war had been unsuccessful. So it appears that belonging to an objectors group or other pacifist organisation undoubtedly helped some men to secure exemption, but magistrates were often eager to prove that members of religious sects were afraid of punishment, either in this world or the next, if they enlisted, and objectors were often asked in court whether this was the case. From 1943, anyone claiming to be conscientious objector was required to register for exemption from military service and to enrol for manpower. While it was evidently regarded as reasonable to have an objection to either military or non-combatant service, neither military nor government authorities catered for the objector who refused to perform civil duties. The official figures claim that 41 applications were granted unconditional exemption from 1937 to 45 period, but in my sample only 1%, 5 people were given complete exemption. On this slide is the table of prisoners, figures from the objectors group in New South Wales that relate to New South Wales, the Department of the Army relating for the whole of Australia to February 1943, and my research sample, Australia, for the whole of the war. You'll see there are some differences there. The commonest offences which objectors were charged were failure or refusal to take the oath or affirmation, or to register under the manpower regulations. Sentences ranged from 7 days to 6 months with hard labour. William Tarry, a member of the New South Wales Objectors Group, served 5 prison sentences. The first one, he was 18 years old, and he's the one that appears in both those columns as the one with the 5th imprisonment. Fortunately for Tarry, he served only 6 weeks of the sentence before being released after a campaign had been raised on his behalf. It was another case of a conscientious objector being punished several times for the same offence. This picture is of the exercise yard at Goulburn Jail. Imprisonment was a grim experience. Prisoners wore rough, ill-fitting clothes with a large number on the back and front, which they had to wear day and night, and which often remained unwashed for weeks. Clean blankets were supplied once every 6 months. There were no sheets. No Bibles were allowed, except the prison one, which often took 3 weeks to arrive, and sometimes had the Sermon on the Mount removed, probably so that the Conscientious could not be comforted by reading "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." Breakfast and dinner, the latter served at 3:30 p.m, consisted of ground corn porridge without milk or sugar, and dry white bread. Lunch was roast meat with 2 small portions of vegetable. At night, 1 sanitary can was supposed to suffice, no matter how many inmates were in the cell. The ventilation was extremely poor. During the day, prisoners were occupied making nets, sweeping, bookbinding and printing in the motor shop or gardening. They were paid for this work. One objector earned 7 shillings in 2 months. In contrast, the few objectors who managed to secure civilian work were fortunate. Some went to the forestry camps in New South Wales. The men felled trees and constructed roads for logging trucks to gain access to the timber. Morisset Camp enjoyed a good reputation, but in some other places conditions were very primitive. The experience of civilian workers in Western Australia was grimmer. 16 objectors were employed in a forestry department camp at Lake Nangara, where conditions were very difficult, including a heat wave with temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit and multitudes of flies. After the camp was closed down in January 1944, one objector, Percy Harris, was sent to Manjimup as a bushfire lookout. He lived alone in a hut in the bush 20 miles out of town and spent his days atop a 124-foot tower keeping watch for fires. What did objection achieve? In view of the conditions objectors endured in prison, the social ostracism and other hardships, including those suffered in work camps, it is doubtful that anyone without genuine and strongly held objections avoided enlistment for very long. The system that enforced military conscription was wasteful, open to abuse and unjust. By 1944, the labour drain from Australia was so great that the Manpower Commission asked for soldiers to be released from active service to undertake rural work. Yet objectors who had been begging to be allowed to perform such duties were still serving prison sentences. Magistrates often abused their power because they disagreed with the stance taken by the objectors before them, and they did not care whether or not beliefs were sincerely held. Likewise, some military area officers refused to look at papers or to register objectors, even though it was their responsibility to do so. Why were objectors pursued so zealously? Did the authorities have reason to believe that they were just the tip of the iceberg, that they represented a silent majority who would also resist if they saw the opportunity of success? The social and political significance of those few defying the political, legal and military authorities was far greater than their loss to the armed forces. After the war, many continued to work for the maintenance of world peace, and they inspired a new generation of objectors, firstly against the National Service Scheme, imposed by the Menzies government during the 1950s, and later the far more iniquitous system which resulted in almost 20,000 conscripted soldiers being sent to a war zone to fight in Vietnam, and 200 being killed there. So let's look at these conflicts in a bit more detail. The Menzies government introduced compulsory military training in 1951 because, they later stated, they regarded global war as an imminent threat. The government claimed that in order to meet its defence commitments, the Australian Defence Force would need to be increased from an existing total of 57,000 men. Penalties for failing to enlist ranged from fine to imprisonment in either a civilian or military prison for a period equal to the period of service. In some cases, both a fine and confinement were imposed. Furthermore, a parent or guardian who prevented a young man registering or rendering service or complying with any other part of the Act was liable to pay a £50 fine. An even more controversial aspect of the Act was the requirement that employers dismiss employees who refused to register. Failure to comply meant a £100 fine. The Act provided for exemption on the grounds of conscientious objection, but this was confined to four classes of personnel. I've listed them on the slide. Objectors to all kinds of military service, theological students, ministers of religion, members of religious orders. As in World War II, it was assumed that religious scruples would be the only reason for anyone objecting to military training. The pacifist movement was faced with the dilemma of whether to encourage young men to be conscientious objectors to national service, or whether merely to support those who already held such beliefs. The role of pacifists continued to be debated throughout the scheme's operation. Official figures state that by June 1958, 419,913 trainees have been registered. 209,906 enrolled, and 3,679 applied for exemption. The scheme ceased in 1959 but was reinstituted in 1964 prior to Australia's commitment of forces to Vietnam. After a 5-year gap, the Menzies government reintroduced national service in 1964, effective from 1965, the year they committed Australian troops to the war in Vietnam. Some 63,000 20-year-old men were conscripted by the infamous birthday ballot system. Of these, 19,000, or almost one-third, served in Vietnam. From mid-1966, the Australian force was responsible for Phuoc Tuy province, which they held until their withdrawal in late 1971. Some 442 soldiers of the 42,700 who served in Vietnam were killed in action over the 6 years. Most controversially, 200 of these were conscripts. The first death of a conscripted soldier, South Australian Errol Nowak, was killed on the 24th of May 1966, barely a month after the first conscripts had arrived in Vietnam, made headlines and sparked protests around Australia. Despite the numerically small commitment compared with the 2 world wars, Vietnam would be Australia's longest and most divisive war of the 20th century. Compared with the number of active service personnel, the proportion of objectors to the Vietnam War was much greater than in the Second World War. Major controversies coupled with graphic television footage of actions in Vietnam, the first televised war, changed the Australian public's perception of the rights and wrongs of conflict. By 1968, there was a rising tide of opposition to both involvement in the war and the sending of conscripted troops. Objectors, or draft resistors as most were known, to Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War included more than 1,000 conscripts who applied for exemption. In May 1970, a well-organised Moratorian movement brought 125 to 150,000 people onto the streets of Australian cities to protest against the continued involvement. The size of these protests and the lack of violence confounded criticisms that this was merely the communist-inspired lunatic fringe giving vent to their opinions. Some more militant protesters, such as the draft resistance movement, set out to smash the draft system. This meant refusing to comply with the process of registration for exemption and included such illegal activities as publicly burning draft cards. The aim was to create mass resistance and thus overload the court system. This was quite different, more pragmatic and certainly more aggressive approach than that taken by objectors in earlier wars. Then, the aim was to convince the authorities of an individual's insincerity in not wishing, an individual's sincerity in not wishing to kill his fellow man. In the Vietnam War era, the anti-war activists turned into much more offensive tactics aimed at embarrassing the government. Would such a strategy have succeeded? In the pre-World War I years, as we saw, magistrates sometimes heard 100 cases a day of boys convicted of failure to attend military drills. Yet the newspaper headlines in the Vietnam War era indicate that there was some degree of panic over the number of resistors who had to be tried in the court system. Despite the differences between the Vietnam draft resistors and their objector predecessors, it is possible to trace a common heritage among all conscientious objectors of the 20th century, and ultimately they won the victory sought by the Australian Freedom League in 1912. No Australian has been conscripted for military service since 1974. Thank you.